The strongest parts cannot be cast. I had known this since I was old enough to stand beside my grandfather's bench and watch him sort failures. A cracked gear tooth here, a sheared bolt there, the fracture surface always the same dull gray of randomly frozen crystal. Cast iron, cast bronze, cast steel, the grain inside goes wherever it pleases when the metal solidifies. A crowd of crystalline needles pointing in every direction at once, loyal to nothing. Strike it hard enough in the wrong direction and it simply quits. The grain doesn't care about your design. It never did. Forging is the answer to that indifference. I had explained it to them the way my grandfather explained it to me, standing in the half-finished forge hall with the smell of charcoal and quench water hanging in the air. Forging lines the grain up with the shape, I told them. Cast it, the grain's random and weak. Forge it, and it gets stronger exactly where it's worked hardest. Baek Tae-ho had nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed what his hands had already suspected for 40 years. Mok Jae had said nothing, but I watched his eyes move to the half-finished die blocks stacked against the wall, already calculating. I reached for a piece of pine branch, the kind that grows curved around a bend in the trunk, following the light. Then I picked up a flat plank sawn from straight-grained timber and bent it across my knee until it cracked. I held both pieces up. Strength isn't just the metal, I said, it's how the metal flows. The branch curve, grown into its shape over years of reaching, would have held. The sawn curve, its grain sliced across at every critical point, failed the moment you asked anything of it. Metal is the same. A crankshaft forged from a billet, hammered and turned and hammered again until the grain bends with the throw, follows the fillet, wraps around every stress riser, is a different object than a crankshaft poured into a mold. Same composition, different creature entirely. The power hammer had taken most of 3 weeks to finish after the water wheel was running reliably. Mok Jae had driven the work with the focused quiet of a man who has finally been handed the tool he has been missing his whole life and does not intend to waste a single hour of it. The mechanism was straightforward in principle, a heavy iron head mounted on a guided ram, lifted by a rotating cam driven off the main water wheel shaft, released at the top of its travel to fall under its own weight, but straightforward in principle and straightforward in practice are two different countries, and Mok Jae had crossed the border between them with characteristic stubbornness and very little sleep. The cam profile had to be right, too steep a rise, and the head would chatter off the cam face rather than lifting cleanly. Too gradual, and the drop height was wasted, the blow soft. The guides had to be true. A ram that wandered even a fraction of a sun width would batter the dies crooked and ruin every part it touched. The anvil block beneath had to be massive enough that its inertia absorbed the blow rather than bouncing it back up through the workpiece. Mok had solved each problem in sequence, quietly, without fanfare, and when he finally stepped back from the finished machine and looked at it, he said only what he always said when something worked. The wheel lifts the head, the cam lets it drop, all day. He paused, looking at the iron head hanging at the top of its travel, patient and enormous. I would not want to be the steel under it. He wasn't wrong. When we first ran it under load, a scrap billet of medium carbon steel, heated to a full forging orange in the rebuilt furnace, the sound was something that went past hearing and became something you felt in your back teeth. The scale flew off the billet in a spray of orange sparks with every blow, each impact driving the surface clean, and the billet stretched and flattened and moved the way metal is supposed to move when it is properly hot and properly struck, decisively, without argument. Baek Tae-ho stood at the working position with a pair of long-handled tongs, turning the billet between blows with a practiced economy of motion that made it clear he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. His face in the forge light was something I did not look at directly. Some things are private. Feel that. Every blow's driving the grain. He had to shout over the hammer, but the shout was not a shout of alarm. 40 years I dreamed of a hammer like this. He worked the billet through a full drawing pass, rotating it a quarter turn between every blow, keeping the reduction even, watching the shape with eyes that had been calibrated by 4 decades of hand hammer work. The power hammer did not replace that knowledge. It could not. It simply removed the ceiling that tired arms had always imposed on it. He understood this perfectly. When we paused to reheat the billet, he set the tongs down on the anvil face and flexed his right hand, the one that had been swollen at the knuckle joints for as long as I had known him, and looked at the machine with an expression I can only describe as professional respect between equals. The hammer's the muscle, he said. The knowing where and when to hit, that's still mine. That'll always be mine. He was right about that too. A power hammer in the hands of someone who does not know metal is just a very expensive way to ruin billets. The machine amplifies judgment. It cannot replace it. Tae-ho's judgment, where the heat was right, when to turn, how much reduction per pass, where the grain needed to be driven and where it needed to be left alone, that was the irreplaceable part. The hammer simply meant he could apply that judgment 1,000 times a day instead of 100, and wake up the next morning able to do it again. The real power came when Mok Jae's dies entered the equation. He had been cutting them for 2 weeks in parallel with the hammer construction, working from the part drawings we had made together, closed dies, upper and lower, the cavity between them the precise negative of the finished forging. The principle of closed die forging is simple enough. Heat the billet to forging temperature, place it between the dies, strike it until the metal fills the cavity completely, trim the flash that squeezes out around the parting line. What you get is a part that is strong because it was forged, and repeatable because the die controls the shape. Mok had cut the first set of dies for a connecting rod blank, a shape I had chosen because it was demanding enough to prove the method and useful enough to justify the effort. The rod needed a thick section at the big end where it wrapped the crank pin, a thinner section through the shank where it only needed to resist buckling, and a small end boss for the wrist pin. All of it needed to be forged with the grain running lengthwise through the shank and wrapping around both bosses, not cut across. The first closed die run produced a part that made Mok Jae set it down on the bench and look at it for a long moment without speaking. "My dies, Baek's hammer," he said finally. "The part's strong and repeatable." It was. I checked it against the drawing. The dimensions were within what our current measurement tools could verify. The flash line was clean. The surface showed the tight worked grain of properly forged steel, rather than the open cast surface we had been living with. We could make another one tomorrow that would match it, and the one after that. I held the connecting rod blank in both hands, and let myself think, for just a moment, about what it meant. We can make the heart of an engine now. We're actually going to get there. I set it back down before anyone could see my face do whatever it was doing. Yun Seo-rin had been present for most of the hammer trials, her record book open, her brush moving. She was not the kind of person who accepted a claim without evidence, and she had made clear from the beginning that forged parts are stronger was a claim that required the same treatment as any other, a test, a measurement, a result that could be written down and repeated. She had prepared the test herself, without being asked. 2 bars of the same medium carbon steel, same dimensions, same length, one cast in a sand mold, one forged from a billet under the power hammer. She had set them up in the test frame Mok had built for the purpose, a simple 4-post frame with a loading screw and a beam to measure deflection, and she had loaded them to failure in front of all of us. The cast bar broke. It broke cleanly and suddenly, the way cast metal breaks, with a sharp crack and a fracture surface that was gray and granular and told the whole story of its random, undirected grain. The forged bar bent. It bent visibly, measurably, and then held, and then bent further when she added more load, and held again, the metal working and deforming and refusing to quit in the way that properly forged, properly grained steel refuses to quit when you ask it to carry a load it was shaped to carry. She looked at the 2 specimens for a moment, then at the rest of us. "We don't forge the critical parts because a book says so," she said. "We forge them because I broke the other kind, and watched." She wrote the results in her record book with the same careful brush strokes she used for everything else, and said nothing more about it. She didn't need to. After that, the work moved quickly. The hammer ran in 2 shifts. Tae-ho taking the first and training two of the senior apprentices for the second under his direct supervision. The dies multiplied, crankshaft throws, connecting rod blanks, axle shafts, steering knuckles, the heavy flanged hubs that would eventually carry wheels. Each one came out of the dies strong and near net shape, needing only the finishing work that our machine tools could provide, the boring, the turning, the grinding that would bring them to the precise dimensions that spinning parts require. The forge hall in those weeks had a quality I have not forgotten. The hammer ran almost continuously, its rhythm a deep, even thunder that you stopped noticing after the first hour and only noticed again when it stopped. The furnace glowed orange through the charging door. Scale accumulated on the floor around the anvil in drifts of blue-black flakes that crunched underfoot. The air smelled of hot iron and coal smoke and the particular sharp smell of steel that has been worked hard. Crankshafts, connecting rods, axle shafts, steering knuckles, the bones of an engine and a drivetrain, forged one by one, stacked on the part shelf in the corner of the hall. The hard part isn't can we make it anymore, it's making it precise enough to spin. That was the truth I was living with. We had crossed the threshold from impossible to achievable, the fire side of the problem, the material side, the shaping side. What remained was the precision side, the gears and bearings and ground surfaces that would take these forged bones and give them the ability to run true at speed, hour after hour, without destroying themselves. That was the next mountain. But first we had to stand on top of this one for a moment and look at what we had built. It was Baek Tae-ho who said it, one evening when the hammer had been shut down for the night and the four of us, Tae-ho, Mok Jae, Cho-young, were sitting in the cooling forge hall with the parts shelf visible in the lamplight, stacked with forged blanks that had not existed 6 months ago. When did we become the people who know things, Smith? I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. The day you each decided you could, I said. I only pointed, you walked it. Tae-ho looked at the parts shelf for a while longer, then nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. It was Ji Wol-yeong who broke the mood, arriving at the forge hall door with the look she wore when the news was bad and she had decided not to soften it. She came inside and stood in the lamplight, and the quality of her stillness told me everything before she spoke. The whole empire's weight, marching to make sure no other dying town dreams what we've built. She looked at each of us in turn. We have the summer, maybe. The forge hall was very quiet. The anvil block ticked as it cooled. I looked at the parts shelf, the crankshaft throws, the connecting rod blanks, the axle shafts, and thought about what a power hammer could forge besides engine parts. The same dies that shaped a crankshaft throw could shape a cannon breech. The same process that gave us axle shafts could give us armor plate. Forging is forging. The grain flows where you direct it, and it does not care what the finished part is used for. The hammer that forges crankshafts forges cannon and armor too, I said. A free people that can't defend itself just gets a slower kind of dying. No one argued with that. Tae-ho was quiet for a moment, looking at the hammer in the shadows at the far end of the hall, the great iron head resting at the bottom of its travel, patient, waiting for morning. What could we possibly still not make? He asked. It was a genuine question, not a boast. He had watched the impossible become routine often enough that the boundaries of possible had genuinely shifted for him. I understood the feeling. I also understood what was still on the other side of those boundaries. The parts that have to be perfect, I said. Gears, bearings, the things that spin true forever. Fire got us the bones. Precision gives them life. I looked at Wol-yeong. Right after we survive an empire. Outside, the veil over Iron Ridge held its pale light against the dark, thinner than it had been a year ago, thinner than it had been a season ago. The summer, she had said, maybe. We had forged the bones, the ore had come out of the ground, been smelted to iron, refined to steel, cast where casting served, and forged where forging was the only answer. The chain was complete from the mountain to the parts shelf. What came next required a different kind of fire, not the forge fire, but the slower, more exacting fire of precision work, of surfaces ground flat to within a hair's width, of gears cut tooth by tooth, to profiles that would mesh without error at speed. And before that, an empire that had decided our survival was a problem it needed to solve. The hammer waited in the dark, the parts shelf held its forged bones, the summer was coming, and it would not wait for us to be ready.